The morning sun draped a golden, deceptive warmth over the ultra-exclusive gated community of Oakwood Estates in the Virginia suburbs. It was a pristine Saturday, characterized by impossibly manicured lawns that looked more like velvet than grass, and silent, winding streets heavily monitored by imposing keep-out signs. The social atmosphere here was woven with a suffocating thread of quiet privilege, a place where the air itself seemed to demand a pedigree. In this isolated enclave, wealth bought isolation, and anything, or anyone, that stepped out of the ordinary was immediately treated with a sharp, unforgiving suspicion. There were no children playing loudly, no spontaneous neighborly chats over the pristine white fences. Instead, there was only the low hum of expensive sprinkler systems and the watchful, paranoid eyes of residents who believed their immense fortunes bought absolute immunity from the unpredictable realities of the outside world. Standing on her expansive mahogany porch, like a sentinel of suburban purity, was Eleanor Vance, the 58-year-old self-appointed coordinator of the community's neighborhood watch. Dressed in impeccable, blindingly bright tennis whites despite never setting foot on a court, Eleanor wore a permanent frown of disapproval that had carved deep, bitter lines into her meticulously preserved face. She was wealthy, profoundly bored, and dangerously obsessed with maintaining the neighborhood's property values at the expense of basic human decency. Eleanor claimed her relentless surveillance was a noble crusade to protect the community, but in reality, she was slowly poisoning it with her own deep-seated prejudices and an insatiable need for absolute control. Her manicured hand gripped a high-end smartphone, always angled and ready to record any perceived infraction or suspicious activity that dared to disrupt her perfectly curated, sterile illusion of absolute suburban safety. Directly across the meticulously paved street, a starkly different scene was unfolding in the driveway of the block's largest, newly sold colonial mansion. Judge Sarah Montgomery, a 42-year-old woman recently appointed to the federal bench, was wrestling a heavy cardboard box out of a rented U-Haul trailer. Stripped of her judicial robes, she wore an old, faded university sweatshirt, practical black leggings, and had her dark hair tied up in a messy, practical bun. She was visibly sweaty, her face flushed with the exhausting, triumphant exertion of finally moving into her dream home. Currently, she was balancing a heavy box of dense legal volumes and a cherished, silver-framed portrait of her late grandmother. Despite radiating a grounded intelligence and a no-nonsense attitude to someone as chronically shallow as Eleanor, the exhausted federal judge simply looked like an unauthorized, out-of-place hired laborer intruding on sacred ground. Eleanor's eyes narrowed into venomous slits as she locked onto the sweating woman handling boxes across the street. Unable to tolerate this visual disruption of her Saturday morning, Eleanor marched across the pristine asphalt with the aggressive, entitled stride of an invading general. She didn't offer a neighborly greeting or a welcoming smile. Instead, she thrust her phone forward like a weapon, its camera lens aimed directly at Sarah's exhausted face. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing here?" Eleanor barked, her voice dripping with an icy, condescending authority. "I am the Neighborhood Watch Coordinator, and I demand to see your work permit immediately. We don't allow unvetted cleaning crews or unauthorized labor to wander around Oakwood Estates." In Eleanor's prejudiced mind, this disheveled woman was either a presumptuous maid or a brazen squatter trying to steal from the vacant property. Sarah paused, her chest heaving slightly from the physical labor, and looked at the angry woman brandishing a smartphone in her face. For a moment, the federal judge simply absorbed the hostility, her sharp eyes evaluating the ridiculousness of the blinding tennis whites and the unearned arrogance. Relying on the deep well of patience she usually reserved for unruly courtrooms, Sarah offered a polite, remarkably calm smile. "Good morning to you too. I don't need a work permit, ma'am, because I am not a cleaning crew. I just closed on this house and I am moving my belongings inside," Sarah explained, her tone firm but entirely respectful. Without waiting for Eleanor's permission, Sarah adjusted her grip on the heavy box of law books and her grandmother's portrait, turning her back on the aggressive neighbor to continue the grueling work of building her new home. The polite dismissal struck Eleanor like a physical blow, igniting a furious, irrational panic fueled by her own toxic biases. She refused to believe that a woman looking so common and unpolished could possibly afford the most expensive estate on the block. Trembling with indignant rage, Eleanor aggressively tapped the screen of her smartphone and dialed 911, her eyes locked onto Sarah's retreating back. "Yes, police? I have a massive emergency at Oakwood Estates," Eleanor gasped into the receiver, intentionally injecting her voice with a breathless, theatrical terror. "There is a burglary in progress at the vacant colonial mansion. A very suspicious, aggressive trespasser has backed a truck into the driveway and is stealing property. Send units immediately. I feel incredibly threatened, and I believe she might be dangerous." Eleanor smirked, knowing the exaggerated threat would guarantee a heavy, devastating police response against the innocent homeowner. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The suffocating silence of the exclusive Oakwood Estates was abruptly shattered by the piercing wail of police sirens tearing through the neighborhood. Two heavy patrol cars careened around the manicured corner, their flashing red and blue lights violently reflecting off the pristine colonial windows. They skidded to a harsh, aggressive halt directly in front of Sarah's newly purchased mansion, blocking the driveway with tactical precision. The sheer speed and aggression of the police response highlighted the severity of the fabricated emergency, transforming a sunny, peaceful Saturday morning into a volatile crime scene in a matter of seconds. For a community that prided itself on absolute discretion, the chaotic arrival of law enforcement was a glaring, unprecedented spectacle that drew the hidden, peering eyes of wealthy neighbors from behind their expensive, custom-made silk curtains. Safely positioned on her sprawling mahogany porch, Eleanor Vance watched the chaotic scene unfold with a deep, unsettling sense of triumphant satisfaction. Her smartphone was raised high, perfectly framing the police cruisers and the exhausted woman standing by the rented moving trailer. Eleanor wore a smug, venomous smirk, thoroughly convinced that her swift action had successfully neutralized a dangerous threat to her pristine neighborhood's property values. In her deeply prejudiced mind, she was the undisputed heroine of Oakwood Estates, a vigilant protector purging the community of an unwelcome lower-class intruder. She eagerly anticipated capturing the exact moment the disheveled woman was placed in steel handcuffs, ready to share the humiliating footage with the entire homeowners association as undeniable proof of her invaluable service. She felt absolutely invincible, insulated by her immense wealth and toxic arrogance. The heavy doors of the patrol cruisers swung open simultaneously as 4 police officers stepped onto the immaculate asphalt, their expressions tense and combat-ready. Responding to a high-priority call of a burglary in progress with a potentially dangerous suspect, their hands instinctively rested on their holstered weapons. They moved with a practiced, intimidating tactical formation, spreading out to flank the driveway and cut off any potential escape routes for the alleged criminal. The air grew thick with a sudden, suffocating danger, a direct result of Eleanor's exaggerated, malicious lies to the emergency dispatcher. What should have been a mundane, joyous milestone of moving into a dream home had instantly escalated into a high-stakes, potentially lethal confrontation, fueled entirely by the reckless profiling of a bored, wealthy woman with a dangerously unchecked superiority complex. Turning around slowly to face the sudden onslaught of flashing lights and tactical maneuvers, Sarah Montgomery remained remarkably composed. She didn't drop the heavy cardboard box filled with dense legal volumes, nor did she loosen her protective grip on the silver-framed portrait of her late grandmother. Despite wearing a faded university sweatshirt and practical black leggings, her posture radiated an undeniable, grounded intelligence and an unshakable inner dignity. She stood her ground in the center of her own driveway, the morning sun illuminating the sweat on her brow and the total absence of fear in her dark eyes. She recognized the immense danger of the situation, understanding intimately how quickly a misunderstanding could turn tragic. But she refused to cower before the aggressive display of force that had been so unjustly summoned against her. Taking the lead, Sergeant Miller, a seasoned 20-year veteran of the local police force, marched toward the driveway with an authoritative, no-nonsense stride. He had handled countless affluent residents in this exclusive zip code, usually diffusing petty, entitled squabbles, but a reported burglary demanded a serious, heavy-handed approach. His eyes scanned the rented U-Haul trailer, the scattered moving boxes, and finally locked onto the solitary woman standing quietly by the open cargo door. He prepared to issue a stern, commanding order to drop the items and raise her hands, fully expecting to confront a desperate, hardened criminal caught entirely in the act. The adrenaline pumped through his veins, sharpening his senses as he closed the distance, completely unaware that the reality of the situation was vastly different from the frantic 911 dispatch. As Sergeant Miller stepped onto the immaculate concrete of the driveway, the morning sunlight finally illuminated the exhausted face of the alleged trespasser. He blinked hard, his seasoned eyes struggling to reconcile the mundane, sweaty appearance of the woman in leggings with the profound gravity of her true identity. The harsh, aggressive command died instantly in his throat, replaced by a sudden, suffocating knot of sheer disbelief and rising panic. He didn't see a dangerous burglar or a confused, unauthorized cleaning lady trespassing on a vacant estate. He saw the undeniable, formidable features of a woman who held immense, life-altering power over the region's entire judicial system. The realization hit the veteran officer like a massive, runaway freight train, completely derailing his tactical mindset and plunging him into a state of profound professional shock. The context of his sudden paralysis was deeply rooted in the events of the very same week, a memory still fresh and intimidating in his mind. Just 3 days prior, Sergeant Miller had sat rigidly on the witness stand in a highly publicized, incredibly tense federal court proceeding downtown. He had testified for hours under grueling, relentless cross-examination, and the person presiding over that intimidating courtroom was the exact same woman now standing before him. He remembered the heavy, commanding thud of her wooden gavel, the piercing, analytical intelligence in her dark eyes, and the absolute, unquestionable authority she wielded from the elevated wooden bench. Seeing her now, holding a box of books in a driveway, was a jarring, almost surreal cognitive dissonance that left the experienced police officer completely speechless and frozen in place. Sergeant Miller's deeply tanned face turned an ashen, sickly shade of pale as all the blood rushed from his extremities in a sudden wave of dread. He abruptly dropped his hands away from his heavy-duty belt, raising them slightly in a universal, immediate gesture of total submission and profound apology. To the utter confusion of his younger, adrenaline-fueled rookie partner, Miller snapped his posture into a rigid, military-style stance of absolute, unquestionable attention. The aggressive, tactical momentum of the police response evaporated into the humid morning air, replaced by a heavy, incredibly awkward silence that stretched across the manicured lawns. The younger officers exchanged bewildered, frantic glances, silently wondering why their commanding officer was suddenly treating a suspected residential burglar with the utmost reverence and paralyzing fear normally reserved for high-ranking government officials. The emotional break of the confrontation finally arrived, delivered not with angry shouting, but with the devastating, quiet clarity of a seasoned legal mind. Sarah adjusted the weight of her grandmother's silver-framed portrait, looking directly into the pale, panicked eyes of the senior police officer standing in her driveway. "Officer," she began, her voice steady, resonant, and completely devoid of intimidation. "I was simply trying to build a new home here this morning, but it seems my very vigilant neighbor across the street is much more interested in building a baseless criminal case." The words hung in the quiet suburban air, a poetic and piercing indictment of the toxic profiling that had just occurred. She didn't raise her voice, but the sheer gravity of her calm delivery commanded the absolute attention of everyone present. Maintaining her unshakable, dignified composure, Sarah carefully lowered the heavy cardboard box of dense law books onto the lowered ramp of the U-Haul trailer. She reached into the pocket of her faded university sweatshirt, retrieving a thick, folded stack of official closing documents and her government-issued identification. "Please, Sergeant Miller, take a moment to thoroughly check my property deed and my identification before this misunderstanding escalates any further," she instructed politely but firmly. She handed the paperwork over, her demeanor completely transforming the dynamic of the encounter from a tense, dangerous police standoff into a mundane administrative review. She was taking absolute control of the narrative, dismantling Eleanor's malicious, fabricated emergency with the undeniable, cold, hard facts of legal ownership and her own unassailable, high-ranking professional status within the federal justice system. Across the street on her sprawling mahogany porch, the venomous, triumphant smirk finally began to slide off Eleanor Vance's meticulously preserved face. Through the lens of her raised smartphone, she watched the bizarre, completely unexpected reaction of the responding police officers with a growing sense of deep confusion. Instead of tackling the disheveled woman to the asphalt and applying heavy steel handcuffs, the senior officer was currently reading a document with trembling hands. Eleanor lowered the recording device, her heart suddenly pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs as she sensed a massive, catastrophic shift in the neighborhood's power dynamic. The absolute certainty of her privileged superiority was rapidly crumbling, replaced by a cold, creeping dread as she slowly realized that her reckless, prejudiced assumptions had just led her into a devastatingly profound mistake. Sergeant Miller reviewed the official property deed and the federal identification card, his hands shaking slightly under the crushing weight of his realization. He carefully folded the documents and handed them back to Sarah with a deep, respectful nod that bordered on a full, formal bow. "My most sincere apologies, Your Honor. The dispatch reported a burglary in progress. But it is abundantly clear that this was a completely false alarm," Miller stated loudly. He projected his voice intentionally, ensuring the title, "Your Honor," echoed clearly across the silent, manicured street for the entire neighborhood to hear. The confirmation of her immense, undeniable status shattered the quiet suburban morning, instantly elevating the sweaty woman in leggings into the most powerful, untouchable individual residing within the exclusive, gated confines of the Oakwood Estates community. The sheer, unadulterated terror of the situation finally crashed over Eleanor Vance like a suffocating, icy tidal wave of legal and social ruin. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble violently, nearly dropping her expensive smartphone as the senior police officer's words echoed in her ears. She hadn't just harassed a random defenseless minority or bullied an unauthorized cleaning lady. She had maliciously swatted a sitting federal judge on the very first day she moved in. Eleanor's mind raced through the catastrophic, unavoidable consequences of filing a completely false police report against someone with the power to destroy her life. The smug, untouchable armor of her immense wealth instantly evaporated, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and completely terrified of the formidable legal giant she had so arrogantly chosen to antagonize over a simple faded sweatshirt. Driven by a frantic, desperate instinct for self-preservation, Eleanor scurried off her porch and practically sprinted across the pristine asphalt toward Sarah's driveway. She bypassed the bewildered police officers, forcing a tight, incredibly unnatural smile onto her pale face as she approached the federal judge. "Oh my goodness, what a terrible, silly misunderstanding. I am so incredibly sorry. I was just trying to keep our beautiful neighborhood safe," Eleanor babbled quickly. Her words were entirely hollow, vibrating with a high-pitched, transparent fear of incoming legal consequences rather than any genuine, heartfelt regret for her toxic actions. She attempted to play the role of the innocent, overly cautious neighbor, desperately hoping her immense privilege and a quick, superficial apology would magically erase the potentially lethal situation she had just deliberately orchestrated against an innocent woman. Sarah Montgomery looked down at the trembling, babbling woman in blinding tennis whites, seeing straight through the pathetic, transparent facade of the hollow apology. As a federal judge, she spent her days evaluating human behavior, and she instantly recognized the selfish, cowardly panic driving Eleanor's frantic backpedaling. She knew with absolute certainty that if she had been anyone else, a real laborer, a delivery driver, or a young person of color, this encounter would not have ended with apologies. It would have ended in handcuffs, brutal humiliation, or a tragic, entirely avoidable loss of life at the hands of drawn police weapons. Sarah felt a deep, righteous anger burning within her chest, not just for herself, but for every ordinary, voiceless person who had ever suffered under the crushing, prejudiced weight of this woman's unchecked, toxic suburban profiling. Refusing to offer the easy absolution Eleanor so desperately sought, Sarah stepped forward, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, unforgiving judicial authority. "Do not attempt to disguise your blatant prejudice as neighborhood vigilance, ma'am. You weaponized the police against me simply because I didn't fit your narrow aesthetic," Sarah stated firmly. "If I didn't have the status that I do, your reckless, malicious phone call could have easily ended in an absolute tragedy here today." Eleanor physically recoiled from the stern rebuke, her fake smile collapsing as she realized the federal judge had absolutely no intention of letting this slide. The line had been drawn, and Sarah was making it unequivocally clear that the days of consequence-free harassment and discriminatory bullying in Oakwood Estates had officially come to an abrupt, highly publicized end. The chaotic commotion of the police cruisers had inevitably attracted the frantic attention of the Homeowners Association president, a nervous man named Richard. He arrived on the scene in a customized golf cart, his face flushed with the terrifying prospect of a massive public relations disaster. Richard quickly assessed the disastrous dynamic. A horrified Eleanor Vance, a deeply apologetic police sergeant, and a fiercely composed federal judge demanding absolute accountability. He immediately shifted into aggressive damage control mode, desperate to protect the pristine, exclusive reputation of the gated community from any potential legal or media fallout. He approached Sarah with a sickeningly sweet, placating smile, completely ignoring the profound injustice that had just occurred in favor of preserving the neighborhood's quiet, undisturbed illusion of absolute, wealthy perfection at any moral cost necessary. Your Honor, welcome to Oakwood Estates. Please let us handle this unfortunate little neighborhood dispute internally to save everyone from any unnecessary embarrassment, Richard pleaded smoothly. He desperately wanted to hush the entire incident, offering to have a very stern, private conversation with Eleanor to ensure it never happened again. The HOA was terrified of a discrimination lawsuit, knowing full well that Eleanor had a long, undocumented history of harassing delivery drivers and minority contractors. Richard promised to smooth everything over, hoping the new resident would prioritize neighborhood peace over a messy, public conflict on her first day. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman standing before him, assuming a federal judge would prefer the quiet, comfortable sweeping of dirt under the rug rather than the loud, uncomfortable, but necessary pursuit of absolute, uncompromising justice. Sarah listened to the pathetic, cowardly attempt to sweep the blatant harassment under the rug, her resolve hardening into an unshakable, diamond-like determination. She looked at Richard, then at the trembling Eleanor, and finally at the police officers who were still standing awkwardly in her driveway. I do not want a private conversation, Richard. I want a complete, formal investigation into every single 911 call this woman has ever made from this address, Sarah demanded loudly. We are not going to hush this up to protect property values. We are going to expose it to protect human beings. Her refusal to back down signaled the beginning of a massive, unavoidable external conflict that would shake the very foundations of the exclusive community. The federal judge had arrived, and she was bringing her courtroom directly into the neighborhood. The Emergency Homeowners Association meeting was convened 2 nights later inside the opulent, mahogany-paneled community clubhouse of Oakwood Estates. The room was packed to capacity with wealthy residents who had traded their evening cocktails for a front-row seat to the most scandalous neighborhood drama in a decade. A thick, palpable tension hung in the air, stifling the usual murmurs about golf handicaps and imported wine. Sitting at the head of the polished conference table was Richard, the nervous HOA president, constantly adjusting his expensive silk tie. Across from him sat Eleanor Vance, wearing a demure, conservative beige dress that sharply contrasted her usual blinding tennis whites. She clutched a designer tissue, her eyes darting nervously around the room as she prepared to defend her indefensible actions against the formidable new homeowner. When Richard finally opened the floor, Eleanor immediately launched into a carefully rehearsed, tearful monologue designed to solicit sympathy from her wealthy peers. I was only trying to be careful, to protect the sanctity of our beautiful homes from outside threats, she whimpered, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with the tissue. She painted herself as a dedicated, misunderstood guardian who had simply made an honest, overly cautious mistake in the heat of the moment. She appealed to the underlying, unspoken paranoia of the room, suggesting that anyone could have mistaken the sweaty woman in leggings for a dangerous intruder. Her performance was a masterclass in suburban gaslighting, attempting to shift the blame away from her own toxic prejudice and onto the inherent vulnerability of living in an exclusive, highly desirable community. The room murmured with a few nods of hesitant agreement until Judge Sarah Montgomery slowly rose from her leather chair at the back of the room. She was no longer the exhausted woman in a faded sweatshirt. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal suit that commanded absolute, uncompromising respect. The murmurs instantly died in her presence, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that made the opulent clubhouse feel like a high-stakes federal courtroom. Sarah walked deliberately toward the front of the room, carrying a thick manila folder packed with documents obtained through a formal police records request. She didn't look like a disgruntled neighbor seeking petty revenge. She radiated the terrifying, cold gravitas of a sitting federal judge about to deliver a devastating, life-altering verdict on the community's soul. Sarah placed the heavy folder onto the polished mahogany table with a resounding thud that made Eleanor physically flinch in her chair. Eleanor claims she was merely being vigilant, a dedicated protector making a singular unfortunate mistake, Sarah began, her voice echoing with crystal-clear, resonant authority. But true vigilance is based on actual behavior, not the color of a person's skin or the presumed cost of their clothing. She opened the folder, revealing a mountain of highlighted dispatch logs and sworn police reports spanning the last 5 years. Sarah's eyes swept across the room, locking onto the uncomfortable faces of her new neighbors. She was about to systematically dismantle the comfortable, racist illusion that Eleanor's constant harassment of innocent outsiders had somehow kept the exclusive Oakwood Estates community safe and pristine. With surgical precision, Sarah began reading the meticulously documented history of Eleanor's malicious, unfounded 911 calls to the local police department. She detailed incidents of armed officers responding to suspicious loiterers, who were actually black delivery drivers trying to read confusing house numbers. She read reports of aggressive trespassers, who were simply Hispanic landscapers eating their lunch in the shade of a parked truck. Each incident Sarah read aloud stripped away another layer of Eleanor's carefully constructed victimhood, exposing the ugly, undeniable pattern of racial profiling that had been permitted to fester in the neighborhood. The wealthy residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the undeniable proof of their neighbors' bigotry, forcing them to confront the toxic reality they had silently tolerated in the name of preserving their inflated, artificial property values. Eleanor's face drained of all color, her demure beige dress suddenly feeling like a suffocating prison uniform as her shameful secrets were laid bare. This is not neighborhood watch. This is the weaponization of law enforcement against anyone who doesn't fit your prejudiced demographic, Sarah declared, her voice trembling slightly with righteous, suppressed anger. She looked directly at Eleanor, stripping away the last remnants of the woman's arrogant, entitled armor. You use the police as your personal enforcement squad to intimidate working-class people who are just trying to do their jobs. You didn't protect this community from violence, Eleanor. You repeatedly invited the potential for lethal violence into our streets with your reckless, malicious lies. The devastating truth hung in the air, heavy and inescapable, shattering the room's remaining sympathy. Delivering her closing argument, Sarah turned to address the entire homeowners association, her dark eyes demanding absolute, uncompromising accountability from her peers. Real security does not come from locking ourselves behind heavy iron gates and treating every unfamiliar face as a dangerous criminal threat, she stated with profound conviction. Prejudice erodes the safety of a community far more deeply than any trespasser ever could, because it destroys the foundational trust and basic human decency that makes a neighborhood a home. She warned them that continuing to excuse this toxic behavior would eventually lead to an irreversible tragedy, a stain of blood that no amount of wealth or manicured landscaping could ever wash away. The federal judge was demanding a complete systemic change in the community's moral compass, refusing to accept anything less. The clubhouse remained utterly silent, the weight of Sarah's profound reprimand settling over the wealthy residents like a heavy, inescapable blanket of guilt. Richard, the HOA president, visibly swallowed hard, realizing that attempting to sweep this massive, documented scandal under the rug was no longer a viable option. Eleanor sat frozen in her leather chair, her head bowed in absolute soul-crushing humiliation, as she realized her reign of terror over the community was permanently finished. The emotional climax reached its absolute peak, transforming a petty suburban dispute into a profound, undeniable victory for justice and human dignity. Sarah closed the heavy manila folder, her devastating case successfully presented, leaving the broken, prejudiced woman to finally face the devastating legal and social consequences of her own toxic, unchecked arrogance. Are you liking this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. The fallout from the emergency HOA meeting was swift, decisive, and entirely unprecedented for the insulated community of Oakwood Estates. Faced with undeniable documentary evidence and the formidable legal wrath of a sitting federal judge, the board immediately voted to permanently disband the existing Neighborhood Watch program. Eleanor Vance was officially and legally barred from holding any position of authority within the community, her toxic reign of suburban terror brought to an abrupt, humiliating end. Furthermore, Sarah Montgomery did not simply let the matter rest at a public reprimand. She filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Eleanor for malicious harassment and the filing of a false police report. The resulting legal battle drained Eleanor's finances and her social standing, leaving her isolated in the massive, silent house she had fought so bitterly to protect from the outside world. Rather than keeping the substantial financial settlement awarded by the civil court, Sarah Montgomery channeled the funds directly back into the broader community. She established and fully funded a comprehensive county-wide Know Your Rights seminar program designed to educate vulnerable citizens on how to safely navigate discriminatory encounters with law enforcement. The initiative brought experienced civil rights attorneys, community organizers, and empathetic police officers together to dismantle the very systemic biases that Eleanor had tried to weaponize. It was a profound, constructive transformation of a deeply negative experience into a powerful tool for civic empowerment. Sarah demonstrated that true justice extends far beyond the wooden bench of a federal courtroom. It requires active, compassionate investment in the people who suffer most under the heavy, crushing weight of unchecked suburban profiling and everyday prejudice. Slowly but surely, the oppressive, paranoid dynamic within Oakwood Estates began to shift from a culture of rigid exclusion to one of genuine inclusion. The heavy iron gates at the front entrance, once a menacing symbol of segregated wealth, were increasingly left open during daylight hours to welcome visitors and delivery drivers without aggressive interrogations. Neighbors who had previously hidden behind their custom silk curtains began stepping onto their mahogany porches to actually speak with one another, realizing the crippling isolation they had mistaken for safety. The Keep Out signs were quietly removed by the HOA, replaced by a newfound, collective desire to build a community based on mutual respect rather than fear. Sarah's unwavering stand had effectively broken the fever of suburban paranoia, proving that dismantling prejudice was the only way to achieve true, lasting neighborhood security. To celebrate the completion of her move and the dawn of a new era in Oakwood Estates, Sarah hosted a massive, unprecedented backyard barbecue at her colonial mansion. She didn't just invite the wealthy residents of the block. She extended warm, personal invitations to the local delivery drivers, the landscaping crews, and the diverse working-class families from the surrounding county. The pristine, manicured lawns were suddenly filled with the joyous sounds of diverse music, laughing children, and the mouth-watering scent of grilled food. It was a vibrant, beautiful disruption of the sterile environment Eleanor had so desperately tried to maintain. Seeing a federal judge serving plates of food to the very people who had once been aggressively targeted by the police was a profound, healing image that permanently rewrote the social fabric of the entire Virginia suburb. As the sun set over the joyous gathering, Sarah stood on her porch, looking out at the beautiful, diverse mosaic of humanity that now felt comfortable in her neighborhood. The overarching theme of the ordeal had been written in bold, undeniable letters. Justice does not simply wear a black robe 24 hours a day, but it is always watching, waiting for individuals to stand up for what is right. True security does not come from fearing your neighbors or hiding behind walls. It comes from knowing them, understanding them, and fiercely protecting their basic human dignity. The dismantling of suburban profiling in Oakwood Estates proved that unchecked arrogance and deep-seated prejudice will inevitably lead to absolute ruin, while the silent, steadfast power of empathy and inclusive law can successfully transform even the most exclusive, hostile environments into welcoming homes. 2 years after the infamous driveway incident, the lingering shadow of Eleanor Vance was finally erased from the Oakwood Estates community for good. Her pristine colonial house had been put on the market, and on a bright Tuesday morning, a young, vibrant, and diverse couple joyfully took down the wooden "for sale" sign from the manicured front lawn. Standing on her own porch across the street, Sarah Montgomery, who had recently been elected as the new president of the Homeowners Association, waved warmly to her new neighbors. The imposing community gates at the entrance were now permanently propped open, a literal and figurative testament to the neighborhood's profound evolution. The toxic era of suspicion had been completely dismantled, replaced by a thriving, inclusive community where the only requirement for belonging was a willingness to treat others with basic respect. Have they made any gesture of kindness that changed a life? Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment, Love is priceless if you also believe in human union.